Alright, it's been a long time since I've done one of these, and for some reason the first two really blew up. And I guess I have something of an audience now, so screw it. Let's do another one of these. For the uninitiated, I've been making my way through this infamous 4chan MU chord chart, one row at a time, and I plan to do so until I either get bored or I run out of rows. None of these episodes are themed, aside from whatever semblance of a theme might come naturally from the choices of album put in the chart initially, and the only real difference this time is I'm not planning on giving scores anymore, because really I only use number scores personally to keep general track of my own enjoyment, and I feel like putting it at the end of these kind of cheapens the effort I put into actually writing about them. That said, I'm still going to put my favorite tracks at the end. Anyways, here's what I'm going to talk about today. Here's what I've talked about before, loosely ranked. And without further ado, let's get into the reviews. Starting off with a band that was basically unavoidable if you grew up with alternative rock anywhere near you, we've got Smashing Pumpkins' breakout hit, Siamese Dream. Now, I think it's pretty easy to write off the band these days because Billy Corgan has made a complete ass of himself in the decades since this record's release, and I know I speak for a lot of people when I say that he's tarnished any of the goodwill I could have had for the band in its current state, not to mention the fact that the music hasn't been any good since Y2K at the very latest. With all that said, though, I think it's pretty hard to deny Siamese Dream is a classic and, in my opinion, kind of a masterpiece. There's a few factors to that for sure, and I'll get to them in a second, but I'm going to be real with you. This might be a harder album to review than the rest because there's only so many ways I can talk about the guitar tone without it getting redundant. But, god damn, that guitar tone is so good! It's like the fuzziest, most brittle, warmest thing, and it envelops the entire mix so completely that it suffocates you and pummels you while still being played so energetically and precisely that you can't help but want to get up and move half the time. And then it'll instantly snap back to the clean tone, which 90% of the time is drenched in some alien mix of flanger and reverb, for some of the most beautiful and atmospherically produced moments in all of popular 90s rock music. You see it right from the first seconds of Cherub Rock, where the quiet strumming clean guitar brings down your guard before slamming you with a wall of shoegaze guitars that would give the previous year's Loveless reason to sleep with an eye open. With the main draw aside, I suppose I'll mention the other big thing that makes it so unique is the range of influences it pulls from and uses those phenomenal guitar tones to actually accomplish. Be it the obvious trend at the time of grunge, which it achieves well with its songwriting structures and energy, or the other obvious label of shoegaze, which it excels at with the aforementioned guitar tones. But there's also the quieter dream pop and the heavier tinges of alternative metal, which give every song its own unique flair. The dream pop in particular is achieved with Billy Corgan's super distinctive voice. Now, aside from being an ass, Corgan has one of the most notoriously inconsistent vocal abilities in all of music, but luckily Siamese Dream sees him in absolute peak performance, and while some will still inevitably find him annoying, there's no denying the consistency, and for me, I think his voice lends a really distinctive flavor to the songs, especially with how pushed up in the mix it is, relative to other shoegazy albums. The drums are also super worth mentioning. I'm not a drummer myself, but while I was writing the script, I got fully distracted like 5 times just drumming along with my fingers on my desk. None of it is particularly technical or difficult as far as I can imagine, but man, they're so groovy and it's just so fun and engaging to listen to from front to back, even in the chill parts. As for the songwriting, it's nearly flawless, with highlights all throughout the record. Obviously, Cherub Rock is a massive opener, and the single Today is beautiful, especially with its darker bridge. Disarm is the huge mega hit on here, and with its pretty orchestral change of pace and genuinely enrapturing lyrics, it's not hard to see why. I have to shout out some deep cuts though, because I think most of them are just as good as the singles, be it the Alice in Chains-esque quiet, the massive epic of Silverfuck, or the guitar wizardry on Geek USA. My favorite song here though, and probably a genuine top 10 of all time since I was like 13, is Mayonnaise. It's the perfect example of that soft, loud balance that the band pulls off so well, with the verses that make you want to bawl your eyes out and distorted harmonics in the chorus that make you pull a nasty stank face. I don't think I could even hear an argument for another song here being the best. When I started writing this, I really expected it to be hard to find words for it, but I suppose that's just how it goes sometimes. I thought that this would be too simple of an appeal to really extrapolate that much from, and yet here I am with more than a page of script written for it. It's that good, y'all. I talked a decent amount in the first video in this series about the influence that the Velvet Underground's first record had on indie music even to this day, and I think if there's one band that will always exemplify that best to me, it's Pavement. Forever indie darlings, Pavement is one of those bands I've always liked and appreciated, but it took a pretty specific set of events and contexts to really grow to love them. Most important of those is that my partner's a big fan, and they're a band I will always associate with the earliest months of our relationship. The music itself, though, is fantastic, and I think a big part of what makes it particularly excellent is the context in which it was released. This was the early 90s, and much in the same way that grunge acted as a reaction to and rejection of the overproduction and glamour of 80s rock, Pavement was, well, paving the way for an even more wholesale rejection of those tropes. These songs are out of time, out of key, out of tune. At times they're barely even coherent, but most of all, these songs are human in a way that I think some of the bigger 80s bands either failed or outright refused to be. The most obvious human connection the record, and the band on the whole, has is vocalist Stephen Malkmus, with his deliberately flawed and always engaging variety of singing styles, be it his regular deadpan-sounding half-talk like on Zurich is Stained and Summer Babe, or the swapping between shriek and spoken word on Conduit for Sale, the wooing on In the Mouth of Desert, or the absolute mania that is Chelsea's Little Wrists. For every moment of quote-unquote normalcy on this record, there's at least one that will throw you for a loop and leave you either endeared or annoyed, but never bored. And that definitely translated to every other aspect of the record as well, with the noisy guitars often giving way to twangy, sloppy cleans that sound like they're barely amplified at all. Solos act once again as a rejection of the precise, calculated leads of 80s glam rock. Instead, they cut in and out of the mix violently and feel like randomly improvised expressions of whatever the musician happened to feel like in that moment. The drums are mixed so prominently and so starkly against the rest of the sounds that the simplicity of the actual performance only aids in the texture and aesthetic of the tracks. Even more prominent in the mix is the picked bass, which, in contrast to nearly every other part of the mix, is completely rock solid, acting as the root that all the other instruments extrapolate from in their own dissonant ways. It can be easy for those of us who strive to push our music listening boundaries at every opportunity to discount just how weird some of this music is, but when taken into consideration the musical landscape from which it emerged, it's hard not to appreciate the sheer tenacity of a debut like Slanted and Enchanted, and throughout the universally understood nature of its humanity, I think it stands tall to this day as one of the best rock records of the 90s. I've been criticized a bit about being far too positive in this series and not really offering hot takes of any kind. And that's a criticism that I guess I can understand, but that ends here. I will go on the record and say that Visions by Grimes has never done anything for me, and every time I try to give it a chance to grow on me, instead I find myself liking it less and less. I think a big part of why I find this record so unappealing is because of the sheer promise that it has in its opening moments, with two absolute synth-pop classics in Genesis and Oblivion. Both show the rawest potential of Grimes as an artist, with rock-solid song structures and phenomenal production. The instrumental ideas on here are approachable to just about anyone, while maintaining that weirdo flair that Grimes has always been known for. Her angelic vocals, too, shine at their absolute best here, as several layers weave into each other over easily the most interesting instrumental work on the whole record. Beyond that, though, is where things get dicey at best and irritating at worst. I feel weird calling into question the authenticity of any artist, but I genuinely feel like a vast majority of the second half of Visions is completely passionless. A good handful of these musical ideas refuse to evolve over the course of their songs and feel thrown together in a way that feels far more amateurish than endearing. The production remains dynamic for the most part, but the songs that go with that production fail to stir up any kind of reaction for me, no matter how many times I hear them. And at the end of the day, that's my biggest gripe with this music. I can forgive amateurish production and rudimentary songwriting if it still elicits a strong reaction from its artistic direction, but Visions utterly fails to do so, and as time goes on, I have less and less reason to return to this project. Neo-psychedelia is one of the genres I've dove into the least, I think, but from what I have heard, the Flaming Lips are a very obvious standout. If you watch the channel outside this series, you know that I hadn't heard their other huge record, Yoshimi. Since releasing that video, I have remedied that, and I'll talk about it soon enough, but I bring it up to say that while I absolutely prefer Yoshimi, there's no debating the excellence of their breakout, the Soft Bulletin. The idea of songs that sound happy but are actually really depressing is not a remotely new one, but I struggle to think of a band that did it better than the Flaming Lips. These songs are lush, extravagant, and jam-packed with youthful innocence thanks to Wayne Coyne's one-of-a-kind cutesy croon. Lyrically, it never gets as dark as its follow-up, but you couldn't really call it happy at all. Be it the mutual rush to self-sacrifice on the opening Race for the Prize, the fear of losing your friend on Spiderbite Song, or the desperate plea to the audience to keep hopeful in times of struggle on Waitin' for a Superman. That last one in particular, if it had found me at the right time of my life, would probably have been one of my most loved songs. In stark contrast to the Grimes record I talked about previously, this album is pure earnesty and passion in a fashion I think only the Flaming Lips could pull off as effectively as they do. For a band who puts such a painful amount of heart into every element of their sound here, I've not heard one person call this record cringe or overbearing the way similarly impassioned performances do in other bands, and I think it's just a testament to how universal the insecurities expressed here are. Sure, everyone has moments of darkness where they lash out and allow themselves to sink into their own misery, but more often than not, we find ourselves smiling through the pain, just doing our best to get by and not burden others with our hurt. In a world that can seem like it wants nothing more than to break us down, it can be empowering to pretend that everything is okay, but it comes at a cost, and I think more than anything, Soft Bulletin is the expression of that cost. The sound of the record is also kinda unlike anything else I can think of. It's all elements that I hear all the time in music, but I'm hard-pressed to draw a comparison that I think would truly encompass the whole sonic experience. It might be a testament to my own inexperience in the genre, but I find it to sound simultaneously very modern and very of its time in a way that I have a hard time pinning down. What I can say is it's a sound I definitely appreciate and scratches an itch little else does. That, in collaboration with the lyrics and vocals, makes for a record I return to every so often, and one that never stops growing on me with time. Absolutely a record that deserves to be here. The first artist in this video to get 2 records of theirs back to back, Modest Mouse is one of those bands I would call quintessential indie, and yet what I would consider to be their big album in Lonesome Crowded West is also perhaps their most inaccessible. Within the first seconds of the record, it launches into a strange and aggressive cavalcade of twangy guitars and Isaac Brock's signature yelp pushed to its limit, which very quickly gives way to a subdued, low-key kind of alt-country section, which builds once again into the almost post-hardcore-like peak it started out with. It reminds me often of the Pixies, contrasting the gentle with the feral with little concern for throwing people off. For an album that's nearly 80 minutes long, it's a bold move to show nearly all your tricks within the first 30 seconds, but if it intrigues you, like it does me, it works as the perfect segue into one of the greatest indie rock records ever written. I have a lot of thoughts about the idea of music which is firmly rooted in and contextualized by the geography it comes from, so much so that I may well make a whole video about it, but for the purposes of this video, I can say that the Lonesome Crowded West is one of the prime examples in the genre. Americana is a style that is already permanently fused with its locale, down to the name, and while musically Modest Mouse never really dove into the musical tropes of the genre, thematically the comparison is practically one-to-one. This isn't Americana for a bygone era, though. This is about the here and now of suburban sprawl and a wealth gap so vast it would be comedic if the consequences weren't so devastating to those on the lower end. Their previous album may have been called This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About, but I think it's here where the band fully captured the highs and lows of getting fed up and hopping onto the highway to escape into an unknown direction. There's a run of tracks here which, I think, perfectly represent the image I just painted you. Doin' the Cockroach is a brash defiance, breaking through and trying to get away from the sprawl, followed by Cowboy Dan, which takes that frustration and turns it into outright rage and lashing out, with moments of clarity interspersed. Those moments of clarity culminate in the penultimate track, Trailer Trash, which, ever since the first time I heard it, has remained firmly in my top 5 songs of all time, and easily the band's best in my opinion. The catharsis, the sobering relief from the anger, and the swallowing of pride to genuinely apologize for the things you've done. It all culminates in a musical climax that genuinely trumps just about anything else in music, period. It gives me goosebumps every single time. And that brings me to something I've alluded to a fair bit already, but that's the unique variety and sheer quantity of different sonic ingredients that the band mixed together on this record. Be it Midwest emo in the vocals and some of the mathier clean guitar licks, the post-hardcore riffing and dynamics, even taking into account the lack of distortion on nearly every track, and of course, the omnipresent country music influence. These might sound like disparate influences, and they are, but the band combines them in such a way that I wouldn't even compare them to puzzle pieces locking together, because that implies that they still sound like separate items. Modest Mouse takes these pieces and makes their own totally separate genre, one I could literally only call indie rock, because to try and get any more nitty-gritty would be pointless. The Lonesome Crowded West is raw, unfettered indie rock perfection. Any bloat this record may have fails to even register in light of the emotional potency and musical innovation around every turn, and now, as we approach 30 years since its release, it remains just as potent as ever. The only thing that could really outpace it wasn't too far behind, and just a couple years later, we got... In the first episode of this series, a video I put out nearly 2 years ago, I talked at length about the personal impact that Godspeed's Skinny Fists had on me during the earliest months of COVID. I would take walks late into the night, as late as 2 or 3 in the morning, listening to a small handful of records each night and just wandering the dead and empty streets of my suburb. Skinny Fists is the main album I think about when I talk about that for a reason, and you can go back and watch that video if you want to find out why. But the other album that comes to mind for me, these days maybe even more so than Skinny Fists, is The Moon in Antarctica by Modest Mouse. Moon in Antarctica is definitely a more accessible album than Lonesome Crowded West. It's more straightforward, less outwardly eccentric and off-putting, and more subdued a lot of the time. It's a record that takes the moments of introspection on their previous effort and pretty much makes an entire album of it. It's not poppy by any means, especially in comparison to what the band would do next, but it was certainly a step in that direction. What makes this album so much more impactful to me, then, is not so much the musical variety like they had previously displayed, but rather the commitment to pure sadness and melancholy. It's a depressing album from front to back, but it's not quite hopeless in the way something like, say, Giles Corey is. Instead, it's a record about coping with tragedy, learning to piece your own parts together, and keeping on going. Like every one of you watching, I had faced a great tragedy in mid-2020 when I discovered this record. It was a subdued and slow destruction of the world around me in my case, but it was also a dread that at any moment that pain would get sharper in an instant and break down any of the walls I had haphazardly built around myself to stay strong. I think the biggest reason this album resonated with me so intensely in the moment was the sense of global tragedy, even cosmic tragedy. Whether it be The Stars Are Projectors, Dark Center of the Universe, or the opening Third Planet, even the title of the album as the whole, Moon in Antarctica is an album that reaches out desperately to grasp the most distant bodies we can imagine and pull them into its own recounting of trauma. This isn't just about me, the album says. This is everything. This is my world. Of course, my mid-pandemic processing of the album felt special in the moment, and as a time capsule, it remains potent as ever, but the album obviously wasn't about COVID, considering it was released 2 whole decades prior. No, instead, the going theory is that it's about the trauma, depression, and processing that comes after a miscarriage in the first track, the inciting incident. The metaphor is thin, but just enough that I didn't catch it at first. Now, though, it's unmissable. Look at the lyrics. Words like, remembering we used to be 3 and not just 2, and a third had just been made and we were swimming in the water, weren't sure then, was it a son, was it a daughter? It's as explicit as it gets, and the remainder of the album supports this as well, while still maintaining the metaphors of space and, more importantly, the cold. There are moments of release from the cold here, of course there has to be, but a lot of this record is absolutely freezing. Can you think of 2 places colder than the moon and Antarctica? The second track, Gravity Rides Everything, sounds absolutely stellar both in a literal and figurative sense, with the opening guitar wobbling and wavering as it makes its way to the atmosphere, being pulled back by the titular gravity at any opportunity. Tiny Cities Made of Ashes has one of the coldest bass lines ever put to tape, and the monotone vocals chill right to the bone. Even the moments of respite on the album, like Paper Thin Walls, feel brief and temporary, like on the other side of those walls, in a storm that inevitably will blow through and leave you freezing again. There was a moment, the first time I heard this album, that is inseparable in my mind from the record itself. It was something like 2:30 a.m., probably April. Here in Canada, where I live, it's still quite cold, and especially that late at night, it was very much so. I was almost at the river, about 30 minutes from my house. I could see that the edges had frozen over in chunks, and the 7th song, titled The Cold Part, started. I distinctly remember looking at the frozen water, and then looking up the clear, starry sky and thinking, this is it. This is the moment that everything has changed. Nothing's ever going to be the same as it was, and this is the start of a new chapter for the world. And since then, said chapter has been soundtracked in large part by this album, this masterpiece. There's only a small handful of records that have affected me close to the degree that this one has, and I'll be forever grateful for the moment it came to me as one of those truly magical musical moments that I think everyone has a few times in their lives. This is mine. Right from that emotional tirade into potentially the most memed album of all time. Never change, MU. I've feared the moment I have to talk about this band, basically since I made this channel, and that's because unfortunately I am one of the sorry few burdened with defending Weezer for life. I hate Weezer, but I hate Weezer because I love Weezer, and I love Weezer because of albums like this. The Blue Album is a pretty major contender for the best rock debut ever in my mind. All memes aside, I think it's pretty inarguable that gold was struck here. Gold that was never truly capitalized on in the same way again. You can laugh about the lick in Buddy Holly, meme on the opening drums on the Sweater Song, create shitpost images of the album art, or be the billionth person to perform Say It Ain't So at karaoke or open mic, but at the end of the day, this album has only seen such massive influx of jokes, both derogatory and lighthearted, because it's a cultural touchstone of such monolithic proportion that we all know nothing could knock it from its pedestal. I would go so far as to call the first Weezer album the ideal pop rock album. The instrumentation is tight, raucous, dirty without being sloppy, and punchy from front to back. The writing is literally the best pop song writing of the decade, I think, with the singles being all contenders for the best rock song of the 90s. What's even crazier, though, is that the B-sides on this album are, without fail, just as good as the singles. Seriously, take any B-side on the Blue album and compare it against the best single from just about any album in the genre at the time, and the song will either match or top it. In the first episode of this series, I talked about the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds and how that had essentially perfected pop song structures and arrangements, and I think if there's any album I would compare to Pet Sounds in that regard, blasphemous as it may sound, it would be Weezer Blue. Take a big song like Say It Ain't So. It's got a ridiculously memorable opening instrumental lick, a verse with easy-to-make-out lyrics, a flawless harmony, and a build-up towards a blistering climax of a chorus, the kind of thing that you either spend hundreds of hours perfecting, as with Pet Sounds, or intuitively stumble upon, as I imagine was the case with Weezer. And let me talk for a second about those harmonies, because genuinely, when I think of the word harmony, this is the number one album that comes to mind. Every single track has a harmony so perfect that you don't even think of it as a separate melody from the lead vocals, which is what I consider to be the sign of a great harmony in general. Get any group of people together to sing a Blue Album song as a duet or a trio, and I guarantee you, every single person will lock into their own harmonic lane and stay there just from how memorable they are on that recording. And at the end of the day, that's just it. It's the memorability that makes Weezer Blue so impactful. It was a statement from a bunch of nerds that pop music wasn't just for hot and rich and famous people. If your song is composed and written well enough, you can be just about anyone and say just about anything so long as it's genuine and you have the musical chops to back it up. The question is whether you can go too far with that concept. A question that would be the thesis of their next album. So yeah, Pinkerton is the Weezer album that I think is a lot more associated with 4chan than Blue, and with just one listen, it's not hard to see why. It takes the same pop songwriting, but makes it noisier, weirder, and more inaccessible. The production is far more aggressive, more brittle, and more sloppy. The instrumentation leans far more towards atonality and more out-there melodies. Oh yeah, and I guess there's the lyrics too. So, the lyrics are definitely a big part of why this album is so infamous. It's why this album absolutely bombed when it was released and was critically panned only to be reevaluated later. This was a record that flopped so hard and was so thoroughly mocked that it caused Rivers Cuomo to spiral and turn Weezer into the inoffensive middling pop group they're known to be right now. It's the album that takes the idea that you should be honest in your songs and pushes that as far as it can possibly go. Is it artistically beneficial to be as honest as possible when the things you feel are repulsive? That's the question that Pinkerton asks, and it's the audience's job to decide for themselves what the answer is. The thing I hear most when people talk about Pinkerton is that it's the incel's anthem, and if I'm being honest, it's not entirely wrong. Rivers on this album is a lonely, sex-craving, depressed guy having a mental breakdown on tape, putting his gray and rotting heart on his sleeve for the whole world to see and analyze and argue over. And you know what? That's exactly what the world did, at least in the online realm. I think what a lot of the dissenters seem to get wrong about it, though, is that Pinkerton is far from glorifying some of the repugnant stuff that Rivers is putting on tape here. Rivers on this album is a pathetic, snotty despicable by his own admission. The record is a self-vivisection that demands not to be pitied nor understood, but simply to be observed. It's fair to be uncomfortable with the subject matter, with the racial and age and parasocial themes on the record. Alienating the audience is one of the main concepts, but I also think that there is artistic merit to expressing the darkest, most pathetic facets of the human condition, so long as the point is not to glorify or promote them. And I think to say that Pinkerton does either of those things would be uncharitable at best. Okay, so now that I've gotten that out of the way, the music on Pinkerton is sick. Take the rougher, rockier moments of the Blue album and amp them up to 11, because this is straight up noise pop for a majority of the runtime. The guitar playing on this album is genuinely unhinged, and I love it so much, be it the buzzsaws on Get You, the fuzzed out dual solo on Pink Triangle, or the panicked key changes on Falling For You. All of it is just so fun and so sonically interesting in a way that pretty much throws out the pristine production of the Blue album, and the result is one that I wouldn't say is better than that record, but is definitely more artistically suited to the direction of Pinkerton. The melodies and harmonies on here are just as good as Blue, I think, and the songwriting from a compositional standpoint is just as interesting, if not more so. I flip-flop a lot between which of the first two Weezer albums I like more, and there's a good reason for this one to be much more controversial, but at the end of the day, I think both are nearly perfect and show off the best of two very different sides of 90s music in a way that still holds water today. Nine Inch Nails is, pretty inarguably, the most popular industrial band ever. The Downward Spiral, in turn, is very likely the most popular industrial album ever. For a genre as inhospitable and caustic as this one, the idea of a band making it even remotely popular kind of sounds blasphemous, and in some ways it is. Nine Inch Nails never has and never will reach the sheer alienating bile of a band like Throbbing Gristle or SPK. Hell, even a comparatively tame band like Early Coil never made anything quite as accessible as this in the genre. It can feel, in a lot of ways, like a betrayal of industrial's ethos, and there are certainly those who hold that opinion, that this is industrial without the soul. And yet, it works. I don't claim this to be a pure industrial album, especially with the strong amount of rock influence, and especially the dance influence held over from the band's debut. This isn't some sonically harrowing or musically impenetrable piece of art, but what it is human, and I think it can only be that because of the very smart, quote-unquote, concessions the band makes to popular music conventions. Take what's probably the biggest song here, Closer. If anything, this is one of the most dancey songs on the record, with that groovy bass line and those jumpy synths that come in by the back half. The lyrics are uncomplicated, unrestricted, and raw to the point that they verge on parody, and yet it's the industrial element that makes it all work. It's those skittering and clanking rhythms in the background of the verses, it's that buzzsaw bass line on the chorus, and it's that grinding synth line that sounds like a Doom 2 sound effect on the final instrumental break that make it all work. It takes what would otherwise be standard 90s fare that one step further into something genuinely impactful. And impactful is a word that I think bounces around with this album a lot. It's not even one that particularly resonates with me. I don't think I've ever been truly impacted by this or any Nine Inch Nails album myself, but I can more than understand why fans of this band are some of the most diehard I've ever seen. The criticism of it being edgy is possibly the most common one I've seen around, and it's one I flirt with on occasion in my own listening, but at the end of the day, I can't make myself listen to music that way. This thing is extremely genuine and a fairly potent cry of anguish and rage, and I don't think the lack of flourished and verbose lyricism makes that any less valuable or pointed. The structure of this record is literally just the title of the album. It's a spiral of misanthropy and nihilistic self-hatred. This is a manic suicidal episode in auditory form, drugs, sex, and all. The darkness of the lyrics and theming makes some of the more 90s sounding synth instrumentals and dance elements all the more distressing, and the harsher industrial influences all the more poignant. It's a one-way trip to self-annihilation, and this ride doesn't have any bathroom breaks. Of course, the ending is a song that we all know, and within my age group, we've probably all known it since before we even really knew much about Nine Inch Nails. Hurt is a faultless masterpiece of a song that reaches a sobering level of self-reckoning. It tears back all the veneer of tough guy masochism and reveals the sad, pathetic heart at the center of the record. There is no honor in self-destruction, and I think at the end of the day, that's what we can take away from the Downward Spiral's masterful dissection of rock and industrial music. I've been simultaneously anticipating and dreading this moment. The moment where I get to talk about what is very possibly the most impactful piece of music that has ever touched me. It's been 5 years since I heard it for the first time, and yet I'm still wrapping my head around the ways that this record makes me feel, what it means to me, and what it's trying to say as a piece of art. Shushu is a Promise turns 20 this year, and yet to this day I don't think anyone has been able to sufficiently dissect or explain it in a way that feels satisfactory to me. In fact, I'm not even going to try. I just want to talk about the way that this album has impacted me over the time I've had it. The first time I encountered this album was essentially on accident. I was skimming for something to listen to on my bus ride to work. It was the dead of winter, and I came across the song Sad Pony Gorilla Girl. Without even listening to the song, I went ahead and put the album on. What followed was possibly the most life-altering commute I've ever had. For context, my music taste at the time was quite basic. I was beginning to transition out of my metal and pop-punk only phase and into more music in genres I hadn't experienced before. But at the time, probably the most out there thing I'd heard was The Money Store, or maybe Slint's Spiderland. I don't know if I'd even heard it. And even then, I didn't get it. This was something different, something baffling. This was something that left me in a state of simultaneous horror and fascination long past its runtime. It was like stumbling across a haunted house where every room contained some new lingering image that would at once fascinate and destroy me. Needless to say, my day was basically ruined. It was all I could think about for the entire shift, and for the entire rest of my night afterwards, I listened to this record on repeat over and over, trying to recapture and to bottle up that feeling it provided, to try and explain and conceptualize what this album was doing to me so that maybe it could translate into my own life in some way. I frantically showed it to friends, none of whom seemed to feel the same for it as I did, and only in that moment did I come to reckon with the first major theme this record displayed for me: isolation. A Promise is a record about being abandoned. It's a record about finding yourself so far on the fringes that no one could possibly reach you. What's more, it's a record about admitting your own responsibilities for that loneliness. You may not be the only factor, but at the end of the day, the loneliness found in A Promise is one that the narrator holds a significant level of culpability in. As time went on, though, I started coming into my own identity. The sexuality of this record began to become far more prominent to me. In particular, it was the distinctly queer angle that the record's anguish comes from. The opening track I mentioned earlier is textually about a lesbian couple's relationship straining from being forced under the radar in hotel rooms and shitty clubs abandoned by society. Furthermore, we get extremely raw and distressingly frank dissections of Jamie Stewart's own bisexuality, such as on tracks like Walnut House. The sonic direction feels like the culmination of these themes as well, with sparse and dull electronics subtly underpinning softened, hushed voices, breaking more often than not into screams of electronic anguish lashing out. And yet, with all that I've written, there's a lot I can never truly put into words about this record, and the way that it makes me feel. There's something in these synths and keys and noise that speaks to me in a way that I can't translate, but impacts me far more than any record I can understand. As I listened to this record again to write this section of the video, something inexplicable came over me, and for just a moment, I was inconsolable. The song Apostat Commander started, and for the entirety of its runtime, I cried harder than music has ever made me cry. There's also the cover of Tracy Chapman's Fast Car on here, which I firmly believe to be the best cover song of all time. It's a perfect fit lyrically with the themes of the record, and it forces anyone who hears it to listen to the original track in a new light as the crushingly sad song that it really is. The stripped-back vulnerability of the cover takes what was originally a hopeful and potentially triumphant song and pulls it back down to earth so hard that it's almost unlistenably sad. One of the most important musical memories for me is the time I brought this record to a friend's house. We were totally isolated, just the two of us, pitch blackout. It was holiday weekend, and we were the only people we got to see that year because of COVID. I don't know how to put to words the state of that room, but tears were shed often and hard. I truly believe that there's a soul trapped in this album, and if I look at it long enough, I think I start to recognize it as my own. With the theme of this video seemingly being indie essentials for the most part, I suppose it's only fitting for Built to Spill, one of the most acclaimed as essential indie rock bands, to make its appearance here. Perfect from Now On is one of those once-in-a-lifetime records that can be really hard to quantify or compare to much else out there, and yet it all feels so perfectly natural when you're listening to it. At once it manages to have the ability to transport you a million miles into the stratosphere, and yet also ground you to your own emotions and the people around you. It's like it's a human record conceived by aliens, or vice versa. Who knows? I think a large part of that is due to just how ambitious the record is at its core. Sure, it can be broadly categorized as an indie rock album and left at that, but as soon as you start trying to break it down a bit more than that, you get into some really interesting territory. You start to hear the ways in which it draws from the Midwest emo scene that was burgeoning at the time, the nascent genre of post-rock that was just starting to come into its own, and even the much older influences of psychedelic and alternative rock. If you've heard this record, those influences all probably sound obvious at face value, but I think it's worth noting how disparate those sounds actually can be and how impressive it is for a record to be able to meld them in a way that makes it almost indistinguishable. I think the biggest aspect of the record, what makes these fusions go over so perfectly, is the compositional work and the painstaking arrangement that clearly went on with this record. Not only are these songs incredibly memorable and contain hooks that sit with me more often than most, but they manage to make longer song lengths seem like nothing. The average track length on this thing is probably about 6.5 minutes, and yet not one of them feels more than 3 or 4. The arrangements are oh so intricate, with half a dozen sounds often playing at any given time, but at the same time, the mix is so clear and every sound occupies a very different pitch and textural pocket, so you can really get a clear auditory view of every single thing that's happening. It's so full without ever getting the slightest bit muddled. Perfect from Now On is a record that it would be so easy to dismiss as just good. There are plenty of records I can think of that I would have a hard time elaborating on beyond it's good because it's good. Think about the Smashing Pumpkins record I talked about earlier. I think, though, that what Built to Spill have crafted here is really worth giving the extra time to analyze, to really get a grasp of the influences and the production techniques, and to really bask in over multiple listens. I have a hard time thinking of a record that rewards that more. This is going to be a bit of a weird closer. It's not all that connected to the other records in this list genre-wise, and it was recorded a solid 2 decades before most of the other works here, but I think its status as the odd one out actually really suits it, and the fact that it was so ahead of its time actually makes it fit in a lot better than I'd previously thought. The record I'm talking about is, of course, the 77 Live bootleg by the legendarily elusive Japanese noise rock band Les Rais des Nudes. This ever-changing psychedelic rock lineup has made waves in the online music community, and particularly 4chan and Rate Your Music, for having some of the most forward-thinking, out-there live album releases ever put out. And yet, not a single studio release. Not one album, single, nothing. And yet, even as recently as last year, the band and community alike have been archiving and releasing old live recordings from the group's original run in the late 60s all the way to the mid-90s. 77 Live is, by a landslide, the most well-known and acclaimed of these many releases. At 100 minutes in length, it was a bit daunting to approach, but even just one listen, it was not hard to see why, and I was completely obsessed. It was like my head was being lit on fire with 100 tiny matches as I laid on the beach. I was literally just sitting there at work with my headphones, stone sober of course, but in my head I was one of those Tool album cover mind explosion meme gifs. I couldn't get enough. It was so unlike anything I'd ever heard before, but so achingly familiar at the same time. Let's start with the familiar, as I think that will be the easier task to approach. First, and probably most importantly, the bass lines on this record are quite literally the backbone of the entire thing. The rock-solid grooves cut through the mix and are basically the only aspect of the record which sounds cleanly produced sometimes, especially on the more recent remaster available on streaming. Secondly, the song structures are quite conventional and straightforward, which might sound like BS considering the double-digit track lengths across the concert, but genuinely, this thing has hook after hook, and generally the whole thing can be broken down into a set of verses and choruses with a couple bridges. It may be freaky and out there, but it plays very safe when it comes to the songwriting aspect of these tracks. Alright, so now let's talk about why this thing is absolutely insane. First off, and most obviously, the mixing is absolutely god-awful in my favorite way. It is 90% feedback screech, and the remaining 10% is all reverb, particularly on the guitars, which, when you can discern them as real instruments, are so disconnected that you genuinely process the strums and the effects as separate entities. There's hardly a moment on the whole thing that isn't clipping hard, and occasionally it will completely crap out the tape it was recorded on and cut out entirely. The vocals aren't spared this either, and you can tell that the vocalist here has his entire mic in his mouth half the time, giving it this really fun, not so serious vibe to the otherwise pretty sonically crushing record. It would be so easy for this thing to break down into unlistenably dense harsh noise, but the energy and playfulness of the concert makes it less of a nightmare and more of a sunburnt daydream. And now to talk about the actual guitar playing on this thing. I haven't gotten to talk about the band Boris on this channel, and depending when I get this out, I might not have talked about Boredoms yet either, but the influence this record had on those two bands and their guitarists in particular is incalculable. In terms of Western bands, you also can't ignore the clear lineage this has in later noise rock bands like Sonic Youth and Dinosaur Jr. Minutes of more conventional chords and strumming patterns will be followed by seemingly twice as many that consist entirely of feedback and manic detuning and retuning, riffs that defy notation or even decipherability, not only because of their playing, but again because of the recording. And that's the best part of this record, I think. You can't tell, and we may never know, how much of this harshness and indecipherability is on account of the guitar effects used on stage, and how much of it can be blamed on the rudimentary bootlegging hardware of the time. It's a piece of music that defies dissection and yet leaves so much room for discussion even all these decades later. And with that, I think this is my most anticipated video ever complete. Thanks for sitting patiently if you made it to this point. I have more stuff going, and I've locked an apartment down for this summer, so I'm going to be able to put more time into this if I'm lucky. Shout out, of course, to the suckers who give me money on Patreon. The Reliant K and It's Boundo fanbase crossover is a lot bigger than one would expect, so if you have any interest in growing that weird Venn diagram, you can head over there for just $3 a month. I'm off to go complete the video I started writing almost half a year ago.